All right, welcome to Access the PodQuest. This is going to be a great day, especially if you're someone who wants to live forever, or at least an unlimited lifespan, and fighting aging and dying. And we're getting right into it with our guest. His name is Adam Gries. We're going to get to him in just a minute, and I'll give you a whole good bit about what he's about. But as we always do, we're going to start with the quote of the day. I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. And that's by Woody Allen. Woody Allen has had a lot of controversy in his life, but that is a rock solid quote that I just absolutely love. And I say that there's an asterisk because our guest today, Adam Gries, is a major player in the area of anti-aging, fighting aging and dying. But yet there's going to be a part here that we're going to talk about where he's not that crazy about the word immortality. So I'm really excited to look at that. Adam is a serial tech entrepreneur who's built and sold 4 companies. His products have reached over 80 million users. 80 million users. He also has a neuroscience and software background and did some MRI-based research prior to getting into all of his startups. In 2005, he first heard of something called longevity escape velocity, which is a theoretical situation in which life expectancy is improving at a faster rate than people are aging. How cool is that? Since then, Adam has been interested in human longevity. It's extending the number of years people live, but also at peak health. That's vital here. All right. After the COVID pandemic, and he was anguished by the unnecessary dying and the deaths, and it was all the incompetence that was surrounding what was happening there. Adam he decided to focus on longevity science as both an investor and as an operator. And to amplify the progress that he saw out there, he wanted to amplify it by 2 to 3 magnitudes. And so he co-founded a movement named Vitalism, and Vitalism.io, which is the website. You got to go to that website, Vitalism.io. Its mission is to achieve unlimited lifespans and for human beings at peak health. Again, very important. I was very excited to have you on today. Adam Gries, welcome to Access the PodQuest.
Super excited to be here. Thank you.
Great. So, Adam, why don't we just dive right in? What is it that led you into this area? Life extension, human fighting aging, and fighting death.
Yeah. In some sense, you could say it was just natural. Some people, when they hear about this idea of extending lifespan, living longer in great health, they just naturally gravitate to it. And that was my case. When I was a young boy and as a teenager, I didn't think about it too much, possibly because, the sense of invincibility of youth. But I'd always been interested in the human condition and how we could improve it and kind of explore who we are, explore the universe. And so when I got to college and when I was exposed to this idea that we could use science and technology to modify our longevity and our health, I immediately gravitated towards it. And it took me maybe 15 years to make it my primary focus because I wasn't sure how I could contribute. And I felt I needed to establish myself in some other vector before I do. I don't think that's necessarily a good reason to postpone it that long, but that was my story.
Great. And I mentioned in the opening here that the pandemic, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, really had a big influence on you. How did that play out?
Yeah, so I had sold the company in 2019 and I was in between companies as entrepreneurs often are. And I was just exploring different things. At that time, I had been living in New York, and my wife and I decided that we were going to travel the world. And we traveled first to Miami, then to San Francisco. And during that time, I was on Twitter a lot, just kind of exploring different ideas, following interesting people. And I noticed this stuff happening in China with the virus. And because I'm a growth guy, in my previous companies, we had often achieved in the cases where we succeeded some sort of exponential growth. It was very natural for me to look at the viral growth of COVID and to map out the likely consequences of it. And so as a result of that, I predicted early how the pandemic would unfold. I wrote a blog post about it in February. And then I also made some investments in the stock market, kind of predicting when the lockdowns would happen and the companies that would suffer from it. And that drove me to this position where I was stuck in lockdowns. My wife and I had made, pretty substantial amount of money on these bets. And we were just looking in horror how the powers that be were just not able to produce a good outcome for the people they're supposed to serve. And there are a lot of opinions about this, but I think nobody can deny that there was a very negative outcome for a lot of people during COVID, and a lot of it could have been avoided. And so, looking on that, I just had this moment of introspection as to my role in the world and what was likely to happen. And it made me think about longevity. So, what was I going to dedicate the rest of my time and attention to, and my life to? And when I looked at longevity, I saw, well, there hadn't been that much progress over the last 15 years. And it was reaching a point where I was also in my late 30s. And I thought, okay, if I don't do something about this, really, especially with evidence of COVID, why should I expect that there would be any better outcome? And so that motivated me to start taking action.
And that action, what was that led to the development of this movement and website, Vitalism and Vitalism.io. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, it started with writing a list of all the people I knew who I thought knew something about longevity. And that list was 13 names long. Now I know that maybe 80% of them actually don't know very much about longevity in the way that I know it today. But I started reaching out to people, educating myself about the biology and the changes in the past 15 years since I had been studying neuroscience in college, and started doing some angel investing, helping companies in the longevity space. Made some investments in companies like Novos, which is a supplement for longevity, Loyal, which is working on the drug to extend dog lifespans, Instalab, which is doing testing, and others. And as I was educating myself, I got in touch with a guy named Nathan Cheng, who's also the co-founder of Longevity Biotech Fellowship and a general partner at Healthspan Capital, which is a venture capital fund focused on longevity. And he and I were brainstorming how we could really make a difference in terms of resourcing this effort from the science and technology perspective by 100-fold more. And that eventually led to Vitalism because we were looking at the ecosystem. We were saying, well, look, you have all these companies, they're really underfunded. You don't have enough people looking at the space. You don't have enough scientists doing innovative things, partially because of the funding and also the regulatory environment and other environmental factors. And so, what could we do to change that at a massive scale fast enough for us to benefit, right? Because at the end of the day, we could sit here and agree that some modification of aging and probably stopping it altogether is likely inevitable in human future. But will it happen soon enough for us and our loved ones to benefit? And so that's how we eventually concluded that we needed something at the societal scale. And anything societal actually stems from some philosophical change and a way for people to coordinate. And we saw that was missing. There was no name for people who shared our ideas and who wanted to create that kind of impact. And that's why we came up with Vitalism.
How cool! And speaking of names, and I know before when we talked initially about this, I mentioned the philosophical or the movement, or not movement, but the idea of vitalism as a scientific concept in the 19th century, even a little bit later than that. That's not what you're talking about. You're not talking about that type of vitalism. Your name is focused on going forward in a different way, correct?
That's right. So you can find out more about it, as you noted, at vitalism.io. We have the Vitalist Declaration, which is a kind of codification of the philosophical values that we stand for. I'll just speak to this question around this debunked idea of vitalism or name from the 19th century. That was this idea that life had some irreducible quality that couldn't be measured or evaluated by science. And that was, of course, debunked. Um, we were concerned about that relationship. And that's why before we settled on this name, we did a lot of research. We interviewed people, especially PhDs in biology. We probably talked to about 100, and less than 10% actually even remembered what this term meant, let alone lay people who don't know about it at all. We also wanted to find a name that had the word vita, which is life in Latin, and the idea of vitality, because we're not just talking about living, we're talking about thriving and being vital. And so that really appealed to us. And in addition, it's a very easy to spell name across different languages, an easy to pronounce name. And the domain IO, the .io domain was also available. And so we thought all those factors combined made it attractive, despite that historical context, which we think most people just simply won't know about.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the current state of the longevity science and how the resources are being allocated in the U.S. Well, and then what needs to change.
Yeah. So if you think about the longevity world, there are a few billion dollars a year that are allocated to this in the US and maybe double that globally. It depends on the year and how you count. Some years it's more like maybe half a billion to a billion. Other years it's been multiple billions. You've probably heard of things like Calico, which was the Google initiated. It stands for California Life Company and Initiative, and Altos Labs, which famously raised the largest seed round in history, $3 billion from folks like your millionaire Jeff Bezos and many others reputedly. And so if you look at the ecosystem, it breaks down as follows. You have money coming from the NIH, which is the biggest funder of biomedical innovation in the world. That's the National Institutes of Health in the US. Their budget is about $60 billion a year. Of that budget, only around half a percent, about 300 to $400 million, go to the root cause of aging. So, in other words, they're not looking at a specific disease of aging, but they're trying to understand aging itself. So, that's a very small, relatively, amount of money, especially considering that the US spends about 17% of its GDP on healthcare, much of which goes to these so called diseases of aging, which are really just kind of another label for the results of aging because they're directly really caused by aging, you could say. So that's 300 million. That's not a lot. So how do you get to like a billion, 2 billion? You have private industry. So these are companies, most of them, maybe 80% are focused on pharmacological interventions. Typically, these companies, like BioAge is a good example, they'll choose an indication. Often they'll call it a stepping stone indication, which, for example, in the case of BioAge, is muscle wasting. So there's a name for this, sarcopenia, where as you grow older, your muscle starts muscle mass declines, and it's harder to build muscle. You've probably heard of this. Probably the listeners have heard of this. And so, if you take a drug to reduce that, you're fighting something which is a result of aging, and you're fighting aging in some sense. But of course, you're not necessarily going to benefit in terms of extending maximum lifespan or even health span dramatically. You might get, 5 more better years, et cetera. But you're looking at one specific system. The hypothesis behind these companies is that if you get that stepping stone indication, then some people will start using that intervention for longevity. And then over time, that money will serve to support other additional incremental and other more moonshot interventions. That's one kind of category, these pharmacologicals. There are other categories like gene editing, which are much more early, and things like replacement, regenerative medicine. So, what if I could take your cells and create a new youthful liver or youthful kidney outside your body, and then replace your existing aged organ with this new youthful organ, but with your same DNA? Would that benefit you substantially? And how would one do that? And then you have things like epigenetic reprogramming, which is what Altos Labs does and other companies, which many have heard of. For example, Brian Armstrong from Coinbase invested in New Limit, which is doing epigenetic reprogramming. Retro Biosciences, which got 180 million from Sam Altman, is also touching that and other modalities. And that's saying, well, why don't we try to tell the cells in your body to turn back the clock via the epigenome? So the epigenome, if you think about our genetic identity and the way our bodies develop, you have the DNA, but then you have these decorations on top of the DNA, molecular decorations. Some of them are methyl groups, and that's epigenetics. And that happens throughout your life. And so there's this assertion that if you modify the epigenetic status, you're not changing the DNA, but you could reverse the clock to some degree. So some of these companies are working on that. When you add up all that money together, and the money coming from the NIH, and the money going into, let's say, labs that are studying specifically the root cause of aging, a lot of that money comes from NIH, but let's say some of that money comes from elsewhere, it adds up to maybe on a good year and maybe a few billion, on a bad year and maybe more like half a billion to a billion in the US, and maybe you double that when you want to look at the entire globe.
Okay. Yeah, and as I was looking at your website and then hearing you talk now, it seems pretty clear that you're drawing a significant distinction between, and fundamental distinction between money going towards aging, the process of stopping aging versus the diseases of aging and the money that's being poured into there. I saw on your site that 42.5 billion was spent on Alzheimer's research since 1985 with almost no results, and hundreds of thousands of scientists work on cancer, and yet there, obviously we know that contingent. Things like that. See, that distinction I think is pretty vital. Not, no pun intended.
That's exactly right. So if you look at the way our system is built, it came from a history of dealing with infectious diseases. So even if you assume that everybody's an angel at the FDA and at the NIH and they have the best ideas in mind to try to serve the population, which I'm sure many do, the history is such where we had some disease. So you'd go to the doctor, you'd have an acute problem, and we would look for a way to resolve that problem. Now, we're essentially trying to apply that same hammer to the nail of the diseases of aging, right? These so-called diseases of aging. But the problem is that those so-called diseases are almost part and parcel of the aging process itself. So if you try to just deal with them by saying, hey, I'm going to solve this quote unquote disease, there's a very famous analysis by Matt Kaberlein, who's a renowned researcher in longevity, which shows that even if we eradicated all cancers, we would only gain 2, 3, 4 years of lifespan and life expectancy because people will die from other stuff, right? They would die from heart disease or dementia or other issues because the body has already broken down and become so frail that these diseases are like a game of whack-a-mole. And so the history drives us to deal with the diseases with the same old hammer. And this hammer is simply not making progress on the problem. And so you see this in the eventual resource allocation, where a country like the US, and this is true of most upper income countries, spends about $2.5 trillion a year on aging, 1 point something trillion on Social Security, but the other 1 point something trillion is on Medicare and Medicaid, where mostly this is going to these so-called diseases. So you look at that, and it's very immediately clear that, look, if you just try to address the symptoms, you're not solving the root cause. Costs are spiraling out of control, and the people you're supposed to benefit are just not getting good benefit.
Yeah, is there some maybe cynical view, of course, maybe not that cynical, that that says the reason maybe for that is that the pharmaceutical companies and the medical industry, et cetera, hospitals and the whole medical program is really designed as a money-making venture. I mean, sure, they have the underlying idea of helping people and that sort of thing. I wouldn't be that cynical, but if you really redirect money from fighting diseases and instead go to the root cause of aging, you're really going to upset the entire apple cart, and therefore, the whole industry could get really, upset. Anything on that?
100%. Although I would say that again, even if somebody had the most charitable motive, their circumstances and the construct they operate in make it very difficult to make different decisions. Because let's think about a pharma, right? They're typically for profits, so they're public or private. They need to create a return for their shareholders. And so the model that they've ended up gravitating towards, because of regulatory and systemic issues, is they have to develop these blockbuster therapies. And so to develop those, they spend a lot of money, which they know is going to drive things that fail. They just don't work. They don't pass clinical trials, et cetera. The clinical trial system is rather, some people will say it's onerous. It's a heavy weight, and there's this valley of death where you need to raise a huge amount of money. And so only the large pharmas can even afford to get therapies to be properly evaluated. And it means that some things, for example, that are not patentable, like nutraceuticals, nobody has an incentive to even evaluate them. So there are all sorts of ways the system breaks. But fundamentally, if you're a company that's for profit and you're operating in this system, you need to get the therapy to pass the phase trial. The phase trials are looking to protect the public and validate that the thing works. So even if everybody's an angel at the FDA, there's a cost to that, right? There's a process, there are good manufacturing practices, there are all these things. And the FDA was built around risk mitigation. So in other words, it's thinking about how do I prevent people being harmed? It's not thinking about how do I enhance people's health? And so that's why you have to have a disease indication for everything. So within that complex, if you're a pharma, how else could you operate? You're trying to get therapies to market. The FDA tells you you can only do it like this. You need to have therapies that are blockbusters to justify all the money you're spending on other stuff. And you really have no path to do anything that enhances health because, like, there's hardly any process to do that. Even prophylactic stuff is generally hard to pass.
Yeah, it seems like the whole system, especially the larger pharmaceutical industry, is such a massive juggernaut that you're really trying to work in that space might be very difficult. But to work in that space, and maybe kind of winding back a little bit, we kind of know what in order to figure out the problem, figure out is what is the nature of the problem, and it's aging. But do we have a good handle at this point on why people age? Maybe I didn't say that great, but that's the bottom line question?
Yeah.
Why do people age? Do we know?
So, in one word, no. There are hypotheses. And I would unpack that and give a few kind of tidbits that could be helpful. The one is, think about it from a practical perspective. Let's say you go to the FDA and you say, hey, I have this therapy, which I believe slows aging. You would have to do a multi-morbidity trial, which is very long, to then prove that in fact your therapy reduced the incidence of all these causes of death. Now, is that plausible to do? Yes, it is, but it would be very expensive. And who's going to fund that kind of study? So there's been little appetite to support that kind of thing, which is speculative because the thing may not actually have that desired effect. Even though people are talking like about Ozempic maybe being an anti-aging drug and maybe metformin and rapamycin, et cetera, but there just hasn't been a lot of appetite. It would be extraordinarily expensive. Secondly, if you talk about kind of different lenses into this, there are various theories about what aging is and how to measure it. We don't have an agreed upon measure. We have a theory which is, there's just this kind of stochastic, which means basically probabilistic damage to your cells, right? You're living, your metabolism is operating, you're exposed to radiation, all sorts of challenge. And over time, your body just degrades, kind of like a damage repair approach. This is something that Aubrey de Grey speaks about famously and has initiated. And then you have ideas which are different. They're, for example, that the software that guides development basically was never built to produce continued health. And so it's not so much that you're damaged, but rather that the software is simply not built to it. It's like a buggy software in our DNA, which just stops doing the things that are restorative at a certain point because it was just never necessary for evolution. You could live long enough to reproduce. So evolution doesn't solve things that it doesn't need to solve, if that makes sense. And so there are those and a few other competing theories. And that also requires a lot of attention. But who's funding it? Not very many people.
Yeah, that's a good point, and the evolution point is a great one. Kind of leads me to a question of like, well, okay, if we're taking our lead from evolution and whatnot, can we say, well, do we, is there a big movement? Do people really want to live longer? Is that a big interest for the wider society?
Yeah, it really depends how you phrase the question. So typically, if you ask the question as, how long do you want to live? The majority of people will answer a number, which is kind of the normative view, depending on their culture. So if you live, for example, in Japan, you might answer some number. And if you live in Switzerland or Israel or Spain or whatever, you might answer some other number in the US. So that's one aspect of this. But then when you add the qualification to say that you will be perfectly healthy, a lot more people expand the number, right? Or they say, I want to live as long as possible. And so, or if you give them the option, right, to consider this. So I would say that when you segment the population, most people, if asked, will say and behave in some sense. They'll say something like, well, aging is fine, but then that's their stated preference, but their revealed preference is to erase aging, right? And we see that with hundreds of billions of dollars spent on Botox, plastic surgery, cosmetics, you name it. And people will say, I'm okay with death. It's not important to extend lifespan that much. I just want to have good years while I'm alive. So people will say that too. But then the revealed preference is that in the last 3 years of life, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars, right, to keep people alive, usually for a mere 1 to 3 years, often in poor condition. So if people are so cool with dying, why are we spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year to keep them alive for peanuts, basically, in terms of time? It doesn't stand up to scrutiny. These things seem contradictory. I'd say that, and the reason they're contradictory is that people don't believe, because of what they are educated to be aware of, they don't believe that it's possible to modify aging and death. And so it's just a coping strategy to say, well, if you can't change anything about it, may as well accept it. And I feel like that's the dominant view. So when we say, do people want this? They do want it. But the people who are willing to confront the fact that they want it and it's not yet available are a minority. And then there's a spectrum of how much people are willing to recognize the fact that, yeah, being alive is great. We want to live. I want my family around as long as possible. I want to be around as long as possible.
Right. Yeah, we do. We put so much energy into the last several years and so much resources into it that becomes kind of a crazy situation just to get a little bit more time. Whereas your idea and vitalism in general, your movement is trying to do something fundamentally different. Adam, we were talking about, of course, kind of building up towards what vitalism is and what the website's all about. Let's dig right into that. What do we have? What is vitalism and the website?
Yeah, so vitalism is a philosophy and a movement to make fighting death and aging humanity's number one priority. And so the idea there is that you have a lot of people in the world who want to create impact in this way, but they're currently disaggregated and they don't have a way to communicate or coordinate to project influence. And so one of our first insights was that you need a name for people to find one another. Today, if you say like, hey, I'm into longevity, 8 times out of 10, people ask me, well, what supplements do you take? Or, do you cold plunge? And don't get me wrong, I love a cold plunge as much as the next guy or hate it. But I I'm talking about something totally different, right? We're talking about, yes, maintaining your health in the here and now. And I do a lot of stuff for that. And that's important, but also creating the research and technological breakthroughs. And so we needed a name for that. And so Vitalism is that name. And it also is a clear philosophy, which is codified in the Vitalist Declaration, which you can see on our website, vitalism.io. You can see it on top. And so the idea is that by having a philosophy and a community of action, we can then create the influence to drive different resourcing. Because at the end of the day, if you think about like how we spend money in a society, it actually relies on philosophy and values, right? Why is it that we spend $1.3 trillion on Social Security? It's because our society says if somebody has worked their whole life and is not able to work and produce as much income, they should be able to receive some financial support, right? That's some value judgment that we create based on the circumstances of a society. And this is true on every dimension. So if you want to then allocate $100 billion a year or more, for example, the Apollo project got about 0.5% of US GDP per year. So that in today's terms would be $120 billion a year. And we talked about how much longevity research and actual aging research gets and science gets today, whether private, for profit, or nonprofit, labs, et cetera. And so if you want to get those numbers, you really need a conceptual values change. That was our insight. So vitalism is that philosophy and movement. We created a foundation called Vitalism Foundation, which produced the Vitalism.io website. And that's a foundation that anybody can join. You can sign up with your email at vitalism.io and help promote this goal, this mission, et cetera. And I can share a little bit more about how the foundation is structured, how it operates, unless you have any questions so far.
How specifically is vitalism going to be doing that? I mean, what steps are you going to take to make this happen for us?
Yeah, thanks a lot. So if you think about resourcing, it occurs at multiple levels. I'll give a few examples to kind of whet your imagination. One is you have people who are deciding about resource allocation directly. So, for example, there is an organization called ARPA-H, which is like DARPA, the Defense Research Agency. affiliated with the U.S. military and government that does research and development in things that relate to defense. Under the recent administration, they released ARPAGE, which is a similar model but for health. Under this model, you have program directors. Each program director commands a budget that can be renewed of $100 million plus per renewal. And that budget can be allocated to research in biomedical moonshots of different types. So if you imagine that we could have a variety of vitalism-oriented or vitalist program directors, that will make a big difference in resource allocation, right? Because remember, the NIH only dedicates about $300-400 million to fundamental research in aging. So even 3 program directors would effectively double that. Okay, so that's a positive step, but that doesn't get us to like 100 billion, right? When you talk about companies that are serving some good, there are many underfunded companies. By having a community and investor community as well that we carry out outreach to and engage with, we can get more funds funneled into moonshot companies that may move the needle. Those companies, if and when they succeed, can drive more capital into this ecosystem. So that also amplifies it. Then there's political activity. As we gain more vitalists to unite together and vote together, require things from their elected representatives, create signed petitions, and carry out specific political activity, we can get resource allocation at the state level. And that could be in every sense. It could be passing a better policy for the FDA to carry out to allow enhancement. And there's what I believe is a great organization that we consider a vitalist organization, A4LI, which is the only lobbying organization for longevity in the US. And there are other organizations popping up globally. Many organizations are self-identifying vitalist organizations, and that's only growing. And in that community, we can help each other both get that political, that economic influence, and the specific positions that can start moving the needle from sick care to what we consider would be true healthcare, which is solving aging through science.
There are a number of companies or foundations, et cetera, that are also in this area where they're trying to promote that shift, okay, that focus shift. Things like the Methuselah Foundation and Calico Labs, you mentioned it earlier, Altos Labs, a guy named Dylan Livingston who's out there, and a bunch of Age X Therapeutics. There's a bunch of those that are doing that. Is there any thought towards uniting your group with them, or bringing these groups together in order to make this kind of change that you're talking about, which is, obviously on a large and fundamental level?
100%. And so the way we think about this is that all these organizations that agree with the Vitalist Declaration are Vitalist organizations. And in fact, because what we did, we wanted to protect the vitalism term. That was actually something very important I didn't mention. If you look at historical terms used for this problem, anti-aging, longevity, they've typically been captured by different commercial interests. I imagine you've been aware of this, right? Like anti-aging now has a bit of a negative connotation among some because of the cosmetics industry. And so vitalism, for the purposes we're using it, is a term that we could trademark, and we have trademarked it. And so now we can actually certify as the foundation or other organizations as certified vitalist organizations. And we've started doing that. In fact, we just announced today our first 10 certified vitalist organizations. And there are going to be more and more of these certified vitalist organizations. And that will allow these organizations, many of which were the ones you mentioned, and like the ones you mentioned, and other organizations, to know that they're all working together towards this common mission. And that's really the fundamental goal of vitalism, to unify us so that we can project this influence together. Now, it's true. Different organizations will have different strategies. And Vitalism Foundation itself, you could say, is one type of vitalist organization. We have our own mission, which is to unify the ecosystem and to try to project influence. And we have the structure to do that, which I'll speak to later on. But basically, any organization, as long as it agrees with the Vitalist Declaration, can be a vitalist organization and can work together with us and work on everything to help elevate them.
That's cool. Very cool. On your website, you have a white paper that I read. And in it, I'm going to quote from it real quick because it does tie into what we're just talking about. It says this. As of April 2023, we estimate the global self identifying longevity community to be a few million strong, of whom 500,000 to a million care about lifespan, and about 100,000 to 200,000 are vitalists. All right. Then you also identify in there that there are a number of people that are really promoting this, other than the foundations and other entities I just mentioned. For instance, a longevity subreddit with 140,000 members. David Sinclair, 368,000 Twitter followers. He sold millions of copies of this book, Lifespan. Peter Attia, Stanfield, it goes on. And you identify that in this paper. It draws that whole idea for me that if you bring those people together along with these other groups, the foundations and entities, maybe that helps that shift of focus between, away from disease control and disease treatment into life extension.
100%. And we're seeing this shift already happening. So there is, I would say, a rather disaggregated effort. And so it could be more effective, which is how we're trying to unify different players. But I would say that the emergence of these different spokespeople for different aspects of the problem is an inevitability because of the magnitude of demand for some solution, right? When society spends so much money on this problem, when the realities of aging, no least of which are in our recent presidential campaign, are becoming apparent to all, it just creates this motive for people to satisfy this demand. And that's why it's no accident that Peter Attia, Brian Johnson, David Sinclair, and others have emerged as celebrities and influencer in this period.
Yeah, capitalizing on their popularity might be a really good idea in moving this forward. In terms of the specifics again, and maybe I just don't want the viewers to kind of get a real good idea of what it is that's being done, because you're pouring money in. But when you're doing that, what is it going to do? What specific projects in order to raise this awareness and whatnot?
Yeah, so I'll explain it in the context of theory of change. So, how will we move from where we are today to 1% of GDP? I mean, that seems unbelievably far, right? So, our theory of change at Vitalism Foundation is that to have a revolution in resource allocation, you need a small, but not too small, maybe 10 to 100 full time revolutionaries. These are people who are doing the nuts and bolts that will connect and amplify the community. What does that mean? You want to organize a conference. You want to figure out which messages will work with which segments. There's a huge advertising industry just to connect people with things that they want, right? How will we reach and find all these vitalists? Somebody needs to figure that out. That costs money. That takes time. Creating new initiatives, spawning new for-profit, bringing together investor events, etc. So Vitalism Foundation believes you need these full-time revolutionaries. And then you need people who will be, let's say, active supporters, but not full-time. They might do as little as click on a tweet or go and volunteer at an event, etc. And then you have the rest of the people who are, less active, right? But they're still supporting. They self-identify as vitalists. Maybe they put it on their social media profile, etc. So if you think about what we're doing at the foundation and how we get from here to there, number one, we're spreading the word to find other vitalists. And so that means running events. We ran a sold out event called the Longevity State Conference. You can go to longevityState.com to read all about it, and that's going to happen again. We ran an event called Tokyo Longevity Summit, also TokyoLongevitySummit.com. And we're going to run a pop-up city in the Bay Area called Vitalist Bay. It's not available for sign up yet, but I think you can express interest at vitalistbay.com. These events are gravity wells to attract people who are interested in longevity and to introduce them to the concept of vitalism and encourage them to become vitalists or to self-identify as vitalists and spread the word. By the same token, we've carried out activities to spawn new companies. So we have working groups where we help initiate new for-profit and new organizations. We've donated to A4Li. We're a sponsor. That's Dylan Livingston's organization. And we support other initiatives. Now, the way this is structured is You can be, anybody can be a vitalist, of course, who agrees with a declaration. You're a vitalist from our perspective. You can support the foundation by signing up by email. And then we wanted to be self-sustaining, and we wanted to have a mechanism that would allow us to grow to achieve those bigger points of influence. And that's why to support the foundation, you can become a mobilized vitalist. That means you're paying some membership dues to be part of the foundation. It gives you a lot of benefits. We have incredible discounts for all sorts of health and wellness services and goods. But more importantly, you get access to this incredible community of founders, top researchers, events, which you get invited to, discounts, supporting the elements and being involved in new initiatives that are forming, whether for profit or nonprofit. The way we do that allows anybody to be involved. You can pay even as low as $1 if you can't afford it. We think if you can afford it, you should pay the full fee. But that allows the foundation to be independent. So where does that unfold? Let's imagine you have 2,000 people who are mobilized vitally. That means they're paying something and they're involved in the community. They've taken some action, even though some of them are like gym goers. They're kind of subsidizing the people who will go out there and take some physical action, right? They're paying, somebody else is doing something else. That's fine. Then you have a lot of emails that are signed up. What happens then? Now you have a community that's promoting specific initiatives. So if, for example, somebody is interested in becoming an ARPA-H program director and they're the head of a lab, we are now sufficiently connected to help them in that process, to help make them aware, to elevate their pitch, and to help them get that position. But that could be about any position. If a company in our ecosystem wants to raise money, the entire ecosystem helps that company get clients, reach investors, and thrive. If there's a politician who supports an agenda item or is a vitalist who wants to succeed in an election, we'll go and we'll make efforts to the degree that we can as a 501c4, because we're a nonprofit social good organization. So we can take some action, but we can't be primarily political to help them get elected. And we've already done this, and we'll do a lot more of it. The more we grow, and I believe if we get to 10 to 30,000 members, we'll be able to make dramatic impact. I mean, just to give you a short example to close this, politician in the US would give an arm to have 50 door knockers in an election. I'm talking about like US representative campaigns, where you get elected by about 200,000 votes. So you can imagine that a very motivated group of thousands of people can start having real impact. And then where does that end up? Well, guess what? The NIH budget is defined by the House Committee on Appropriations for Health and Human Services and by the Senate Parallel Committee. Those committees have 17 members each. Imagine if 3 members in each of those committees were insistent that we need more money to study the fundamental problem of aging. In the horse trading of politics, that could move billions of dollars. These things can happen in just a few years if we put our minds to it.
Very cool. What about the idea? Have you given any consideration to reaching out to celebrities, music people, actors, those kinds of things that have massive followings along tons of different areas and age groups, etc. Reaching out to them to harness that to kind of hit that critical mass point.
100%. And we've already done that. We have some people who are pretty well known in our private groups. I won't name names because some of them don't necessarily want to be public about it. But we are also reaching out to people who I believe will be happy to be public. And I think it's critical. So if you look at certain celebrities and what they've done for industries, I agree with you. It's remarkable.
Yeah, someone like, Angelina Jolie, she's got this, of course, a massive following. I want to shift real quickly because I mentioned this in the opening and I really want to hit this. And that's the idea of living forever, right? I mean, we're talking about unlimited lifespans, but at peak health, which is, again, a big part of the puzzle. But what about living like literally forever? And I use the word immortality. You don't like that
Yes.
word. What's going on with that?
Yeah, thank you. So here's the thing. When we think about living very long, we're really asking about what is the nature of humanity in the future. This is a very complicated, nuanced question. We can't even predict the outcome of the election coming up in the US or elsewhere. So how could we predict what the nature of humanity is going to be in 100 years, let alone 1,000 or 1,000,000 years? People are talking today about, you know, AI modifying humans and merging with technology. Who knows what's going to happen and how it's going to happen? So I think um, it's very full of hubris to try to assume or just limited to take some case and cherry pick that case and say, oh, that might be the future in 1,000,000 years. The answer is we just have no idea. Now, the question that we really should be asking ourselves is what can we do to live as long as possible because we know life is good without creating hypotheses about things that are so far beyond our understanding or beyond the data we have. And that's where immortality is the problem word, because this is not about, sure, I agree with that not dying is a good thing, but the word immortal has these both these religious connotations and a connotation that it is impossible to die. And even if we solve aging, you might still get hit by a bus and die. And even if we solve, getting hit by a bus, I mean, who knows what's going to happen in 1,000 years? What if there's like some solar flare? Are we going to be defended from that? I have no idea. I certainly think that we, the people who are alive, should make as much of an effort as possible to secure the individual life and well-being of everybody who is now alive. I totally believe that. But it's just premature to use these words, and they end up being used as a kind of ammunition to diminish this initiative, as if wanting to solve aging is some sort of fantasy or something that is relegated to, I don't know, heart wishes and not grounded in reality. Where what our problem is that we are spending vast amounts of money, we're not getting any return for it, and people are aging and dying as we speak.
Yeah, it's funny you said that. I circled on my notes here. You can see I circled the words "hit by bus." All right, and you said the same thing.
Yeah.
If you fix the aging problem, that doesn't mean you fix the living forever problem, because you could get hit by a bus. There's a whole tons of other diseases, wars, and whatnot. So I think your point is very well taken on that. I still like the word immortality, but immortal. It's a very cool word, but I hear your point. An asteroid, and of course the sun's going to eventually enlarge, get enlarged, and then that's going to be the end of us in the long run anyway, unless we get off the planet. But speaking of the planet, what about, okay, people are starting to live a lot longer. There's more and more people, of course, still coming into the world. What about overpopulation? Is that a concern for vitalism in general?
I think that this is another one of those imaginary problems where we cherry pick a specific outcome, right? This is paralleled in the Malthusian concern from the 17th or 18th century, where they said, "Oh, well, there won't be enough food to feed everybody, so we have to somehow radically control the population, etc." And of course, what happened was that Fritz Haber and others developed a fertilizer, and we were able to produce a lot more food. And now, there's that famous post by Tim Urban where he talks about how you could fit all of humanity in like a small square. You know what I mean? If you just made it very dense, like the Earth still has a lot of space, and it's probably likely that we'll be able to develop a lot more food if we need to. And in fact, our problem today is that population is shrinking in most places in the world. So there are multiple answers to this question. One is why cherry pick this negative outcome and not think about all the positive outcomes? Two is, let's say we had this problem, and in fact, there was not enough resource, not enough food to feed everybody, etc. Is your first solution to start killing people off? I mean, that sounds extremely unethical to me. I mean, this would be the last solution. I would try anything else before I got to that solution. And so I just feel like this overpopulation concern is really a bit of a red herring.
Okay, what about the boredom problem? Okay, I mean, like you live to 195 years old or 300 years or whatever. People have
Yeah.
complained when I talk about immortality in general. They're like, "Oh, I'll be bored. I don't want to sit there forever."
Yeah. It's really interesting. I really see that as kind of a grasping for straws. You know what I mean? Just imagine somebody is giving a terminal diagnosis, and you tell them, hey, instead of a year, you're just going to be able to continue living. Is their response going to be like, nah, I might feel bored? That's a problem. That's a problem for me. I don't think I'll take this pill. It's just so absurd. I I mean, at the end of the day, this is really all about free choice. If somebody is so unhappy, they don't want to live anymore. I mean, sure, they should be able to kill themselves. I think typically when we think about that, I mean, humanity, society, when somebody commits suicide, in most cultures, almost all cultures, we don't say, "Oh, well, that's what they wanted." So, cool. I like tomatoes. This guy liked suicide. No, we say, "Oh, that's a tragedy, right? Like maybe we could have gone to this person in time and convinced them to reconsider and that life is worth living, right? Because we cherish life as a kind of fundamental value in human society already. We have a really good foundation for cherishing life. And so when you think about it, the odds that people are really going to be so bored they want to commit suicide are low. I support people's right to do that if they want to. And secondly, even if they do commit suicide, our current, let's say, value system, and who knows how it might change in the future, says that typically society would resist that and try to give meaning to their life.
Adam, we talked a little bit before about AI. You mentioned it, and I really want to kind of dig into that. I'm going to start us off with a quote. All right, so and I'm a big quote guy, as you're going to see, or as you might have seen. Ray Kurzweil. He is, of course, the one of the big names in AI and the singularity concept, etc. He was interviewed on YouTube by Nick Thompson, the CEO of The Atlantic, and former editor of Wired. This was a while ago, but not too long ago. I think it was earlier in 2024. Anyway, the audience was, it was a live audience event, and he said, Ray said. Ray Kurzweil, his quote, okay, if they're alive in 5 years, they will likely live to 500 years old if they're diligent. What do you have to say about that? The reason is that, of course, if AI is just churning away and it's going to become this massive thing that's going to overtake everything, fundamentally upset the entire progress of humanity, why worry about aging when AI is going to pick up and we're going to integrate with AI and move forward from there?
Yeah. I love that you brought this up, and it evokes a few thoughts. One thought is that, you know, the belief that AI is just going to come and quote unquote save us is, while potentially an outcome, also potentially hopium, right? So just imagine somebody who's trying to resist something which is very scary, et cetera, and they're giving this lifeline where they say, hey, if you just believe in AI, you don't have to worry about this. That's a big risk, right? So by hearing this kind of messaging, which I've heard from Kurzweil and others, I think a lot of people use that as a kind of reason to not take action. That's a huge problem. It's almost parallel in terms of weight to the other side of the equation, which is saying like, well, there's nothing we can do. It's inevitable that we'll age and die. And that's why I'm not taking action. Because taking action when something is so monumental and seems so difficult and it's scary. I mean, I don't like thinking about aging and death. Nobody does. Is hard. And so I think that's one problem with this kind of messaging. But now to the detail of it. So, in other words, what is the likelihood that in fact this is true? I think the question one has to ask themselves is, what is my confidence in this? For example, if you're playing Russian roulette, you have an 80 something percent chance of being alive. But do you want to play Russian roulette with your life? I mean, I would say we just don't know about AI. A lot of people look at AI and they say, well, you know, it's producing things based on data that humans have created. So will it truly be able to carry out creative innovation in the sciences that are fundamental? How will that unfold and on what timeline? The answer is nobody knows. And so while I'm a huge supporter of AI, and in fact, I think AI could really dramatically help with longevity, but even so, that AI will need data, biological data, other data. And I think it's just really, um, it's completely upside down to say we shouldn't do anything because AI is coming to the rescue. On the contrary, we should leverage AI and work as hard as possible with the tools that we have to devote as many resources as possible to solve the problem. And if it happens, and if it happens early thanks to AI, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and you said early. That's a really good point. I mean, I know Ray Kurzweil is very optimistic about how quickly things are happening, and his predictions in large part, have been right. But it could also be hundreds or even thousands of years away with problems that we don't know about.
It's tempting to engage in this kind of speculation around AI. It's exciting. It's like the world is going to change. Well, we have artificial general intelligence, artificial super intelligence. The matter of fact is, we have an extended maximum lifespan at all, not even 1 year, not 5 years. So, sure, this may happen, but it's really not worth staking our lives on it and making almost no effort, which is unfortunately the case right now. We have to operate on both those levels.
Yeah, very good. All right, Adam, I'd like to invite you to add anything else you'd like to cover here. Any other topics or any other points that you want to make, maybe even a summation.
Sure. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for having me. I'll just say that if one of the listeners hears this, if you listen to this and you feel that you resonate with this idea that we should try our hardest about death and aging, then I'd encourage you to join us. Go to vitalism.io, join with your email, and I'd encourage you to mobilize. If you can afford it, it's very affordable, $29 a month. It's less than $1 a day. If you can't afford it, you can sign up for just $1. You can actually define your own price. We're not trying to gate people out by setting a price for it. And what I would just encourage you to think is that if you believe that we need to make a change in how we resource things, you need to have a plan for how to do that. And I believe that Vitalism has a good plan, the best plan right now, to accelerate our motion towards this outcome of extending lifespans. So if you agree with that, join us. And if you have a better idea, then let me know about it. Adam at vitalism.io. You can email me directly. You can ping me. You can find me on Twitter. And let's make this change happen as soon as possible together.
Sounds great. I know I'm going to be one of those people. I'm going to go out right now and hit the join button and become a mobilized vitalist myself. So I encourage all of the listeners, anyone who encounters this interview, to do the same thing. And also, of course, go to our website, which is accessthepodquest.com. We're going to have a lot of information about. Well, of course, we'll post the interview, but we'll have a lot of information about Vitalism and vitalism.io up there. Also, come back here to YouTube and like the video, join subscribe, which again is vital. I keep saying vital, but it is. Join us. Join Adam Gries in his movement. You guys go there. We will be going ever forward.